He was the most feared monster of them all. We're of course talking about the angel of death, Josef Mengele. Although trained as a doctor to preserve life, he brought a sadistic cruelty to the experiments that ended the lives.
They stepped off the trains, broken and terrified, clinging to the faint hope that a doctor's presence meant safety. Instead, they were met by a man in a white coat whose decisions meant life, death, or something far worse. With a flick of his hand, families were torn apart, children were taken, and countless lives were ended. Behind the mask of medicine, he carried out experiments so cruel they defied imagination. His name was Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death.
Walpurga was an obese woman who had a stern reputation and a voracious appetite. She doted on her eldest son and was much closer to him than she was to her husband. For his part, Josef proved to be a quiet child whose main goal was to please his overbearing mother.
One of history's most chilling reminders of how science can be twisted into horror. Mengele's reputation as a figure of cruelty and horror overshadows almost everything else about him. Yet when we look back at his early life, there is no clear warning sign that he would become one of the most notorious doctors of the Holocaust. He was born on March 16, 1911, in the town of Günzburg, in Bavaria, Germany. His family was relatively well off, owning a successful farm equipment company. He had a stable childhood, free from abuse or major trauma. Unlike other figures associated with violence or extremism, there were no obvious signs in his upbringing that could explain the path he would eventually take. As a teenager, Mengele's life took a brief turn when he developed a serious bone infection at the age of 15. The illness forced him to spend several months bedridden and away from school. While he eventually recovered without any lasting physical damage, the experience left him behind in his studies. Determined not to fall behind permanently, he pushed himself to catch up with his classmates and went on to perform well academically. In fact, he surpassed many of his peers and became known as a strong student. This new drive and discipline carried him into higher education, where his path to medicine and anthropology began. In 1930, Mengele enrolled at Munich University to study anthropology. By most accounts, he was both intelligent and charismatic, traits that helped him move easily through the academic and social circles of university life. It was during this period that he encountered the scientific and political ideas that would shape his worldview. At the time, the concept of eugenics was widely accepted among many academics and researchers. Eugenics argued that human beings could be improved by controlling reproduction, encouraging the fit to have children while preventing the unfit from passing on their genes. These ideas, now recognized as pseudoscience, were influential in Germany and across much of the Western world in the early 20th century. Mengele absorbed these teachings enthusiastically. He came to believe that certain groups, especially Aryans, were superior to others, and that people considered undesirable, such as those with disabilities or those living in poverty, should not reproduce. These ideas fit neatly with the racial theories promoted by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, which was gaining momentum in Germany at the time. Eugenics, in other words, provided a scientific cover for racism, discrimination, and eventually genocide. For Mengele, it became the foundation of his career. In 1935, he completed his doctorate in anthropology, writing a thesis on jaw structure among different racial groups. 2 years later, he also earned a medical degree from Frankfurt University. His academic achievements placed him at the center of racial science in Germany. He worked under Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a leading figure in hereditary biology and racial hygiene. Von Verschuer was deeply involved in eugenics research and believed strongly in applying these ideas to public policy. Under his supervision, Mengele learned how to combine medical research with ideology, and he became particularly interested in studying twins. Twins, he thought, offered a unique way to investigate heredity because they provided a natural comparison between two people with nearly identical genetic material. At the same time, Mengele was becoming more politically active. In 1937, he joined the Nazi Party. A year later, he became a member of the SS, the elite organization that served as both a paramilitary force and a key instrument of Nazi control. By the end of the 1930s, Mengele's professional life and political loyalty were fully aligned with the regime. He had the academic background to conduct research, the ideological commitment to racial theories, and the organizational connections to the SS that would allow him to rise quickly once the war began. In 1938, he carried out a short period of compulsory military service as a rifleman. The following year, he married Irene Schoenben, just as Europe moved toward war. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and launched World War II, Mengele was drawn further into the activities of the SS. He first worked for the Race and Resettlement Office in Poland, where he evaluated whether individuals were suitable for Germanization according to Nazi racial standards. Later, he served as a medical officer on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. There, he showed moments of personal bravery, including rescuing fellow soldiers from a burning tank, which earned him the Iron Cross. In 1942, he was badly injured during combat and had to leave frontline duty. This injury turned out to be a turning point in his career. No longer able to serve at the front, Mengele returned to academic and medical research, this time under the patronage of his old mentor von Verschuer. With his connections and reputation secure, he began to look for opportunities where he could conduct large-scale research without limitations. What he wanted was access to human subjects in large numbers, freedom from ethical restrictions, and the authority to pursue his interests in genetics and heredity without interference. In the context of Nazi Germany, that wish led to a chilling request to be sent to Auschwitz. On May 30, 1943, Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Officially, he was appointed as the chief physician for the Roma, or Gypsy, section of the camp. In practice, however, he had almost complete authority as a doctor across the complex. This meant he could not only treat or withhold treatment as he wished, but also had direct involvement in one of the camp's most horrifying routines: the selections. When trains carrying new prisoners arrived at the camp, doctors were stationed on the platform to decide who would live and who would die. Those deemed fit for labor were sent into the camp, where they would be worked until exhaustion or illness claimed them. The elderly, the sick, and young children were often sent straight to the gas chambers. And those who caught Mengele's eye for research, especially twins, dwarfs, or people with unusual physical traits, were pulled aside for experimentation. Unlike many other SS officers, who were often disturbed by the selections and sometimes turned to alcohol to cope, Mengele appeared calm, even indifferent. Survivors later recalled how he would make life or death decisions with the ease of someone choosing what to eat for dinner. For him, it was routine, even an opportunity. His scientific ambitions and Nazi ideology came together perfectly in Auschwitz, giving him both the subjects and the freedom he had long desired. From that moment, Josef Mengele's name would become permanently linked with the horrors of the Holocaust. When Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943, he stepped into a world where ideology and medicine became deeply entangled. His position gave him enormous power over the lives of prisoners, and it was power he used without hesitation. He quickly became central to one of the most terrifying aspects of life at the camp: the selections. Each time a train pulled into the platform, hundreds of exhausted, frightened men, women, and children were forced out and lined up. Their fates were decided in moments. Mengele would stand with other officers and examine each prisoner, often with just a glance. Those who seemed healthy enough for forced labor were sent into the camp. Those who looked too weak, elderly, sick, or young, were sent directly to the gas chambers. But there was also a third category, reserved for individuals who caught Mengele's interest: twins, dwarfs, people with unusual physical features, or simply those he wanted for his research were separated and taken aside. These people did not know it, but they had been chosen to endure medical experiments in the name of Nazi science. Mengele performed these selections hundreds of times, and survivors recalled the unsettling calmness with which he did his work. For most, deciding the fate of entire groups of people would have been unbearable. Some SS doctors reportedly drank heavily to cope. Mengele, however, appeared almost indifferent, sometimes even cheerful. Witnesses described how he would whistle classical music as he moved down the lines of prisoners, raising a hand left or right to determine life or death. His lack of emotion, paired with his authority, gave him a terrifying reputation among inmates. In addition to the selections, Mengele oversaw medical responses to disease outbreaks within the camp. The overcrowded, unsanitary conditions meant illness spread quickly. But instead of treating patients, his solution was often extermination. In February 1944, during a typhus outbreak, he ordered 600 women to be gassed so their barracks could be disinfected. He then transferred to another group of women, only to repeat the process if disease spread again. Later that year, when another outbreak struck, he ordered the deaths of thousands in an entire section of the camp, rather than attempting treatment. For him, mass killing was simply another tool of public health. While these acts were cruel enough, it was Mengele's experiments that cemented his reputation as one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust. His primary obsession was twins. Twins, he believed, held the key to understanding heredity. By studying their similarities and differences, he thought he could uncover genetic traits and even find ways to increase the birth of Aryan twins to strengthen the German population. To pursue this goal, twins arriving at Auschwitz were separated from their families and taken to special barracks. Some families even handed their twins over willingly, hoping that they might be given better treatment. In reality, the twins were subjects for some of the most horrific experiments carried out during the war. One twin would often be used as a control, while the other underwent procedures, and when one died, the surviving twin was usually killed, so that their organs could be compared. The experiments themselves were brutal. Mengele and his team conducted endless medical examinations, taking blood, spinal fluid, and tissue samples. Children were often left weak and sick after repeated withdrawals, with little concern for their survival. There were forced blood transfusions between twins, frequently ignoring blood type compatibility, leading to agonizing reactions and death. Survivors reported cases where twins were surgically mutilated, or even sewn together in grotesque attempts to create conjoined twins. One account described children who had been stitched together vein by vein, their wounds left infected and untreated, causing them to scream through the night until they eventually died. Mengele's obsession was not limited to twins. He also targeted people with dwarfism, unusual physical traits, or eye conditions. He took particular interest in heterochromia, a condition where someone has two different colored eyes. Hoping to understand the genetic basis of eye color, he extracted hundreds of eyeballs from living and deceased prisoners, sending them to research institutes in Germany. Dwarfs too were catalogued and studied before being killed, with their skeletons preserved for further analysis. One of the most disturbing elements of Mengele's work was how he disguised his cruelty behind a mask of kindness, at least in some settings. He ran what appeared to be a kindergarten for Roma children, where he handed out sweets, toys, and good food. The children called him uncle, and he smiled and played with them. But this was a facade. Behind closed doors, many of those same children were taken for experiments, never to return. Even the toys he gave out were often taken from murdered Jewish children elsewhere in the camp. To visitors, the kindergarten gave the impression of care, but in reality, it was a tool to mask the horror of his laboratory work. Mengele's methods were systematic. Every subject was photographed, measured, and documented. He kept meticulous records of physical features, blood samples, and X-rays. In this way, torture was turned into research, and murder was presented as data collection. His laboratories inside the camp contained preserved organs, jars filled with body parts, and piles of notes, as though this suffering could be justified as science. Beyond the twin studies, Mengele used outbreaks of disease as opportunities for experimentation. When Noma, a severe infection often seen in malnourished children, spread in the Roma camp, he set up a hospital to study the illness. Rather than treating patients, he observed the disease progress until they died. Afterwards, he dissected their bodies and preserved tissue samples. For him, each patient was not a human being but a case study, a piece of evidence to be catalogued. The cruelty of these experiments left lasting trauma on survivors. Many twins who lived through Auschwitz described the constant fear of being summoned to the laboratory. Even those who were not directly experimented on lived with the anxiety that they could be taken at any time. For children especially, the confusion of being treated kindly one moment and subjected to pain, the next left deep psychological scars. Survivors spoke of being weighed, measured, and photographed endlessly, as though their humanity had been stripped away and replaced with nothing but numbers and files. It is difficult to know the exact number of victims. Estimates suggest that at least 1,500 pairs of twins passed through Mengele's hands, with only around 100 pairs surviving. Countless others, including dwarfs and prisoners with unusual traits, were also subjected to his experiments. And beyond those directly experimented on, tens of thousands more were sent to the gas chambers under his orders, during selections, or exterminated during his disease control measures. By 1944, Auschwitz had become a place where Nazi racial theories were tested on a massive scale, and Josef Mengele was at the center of it. To him, the camp provided what no university or hospital ever could: a limitless supply of human subjects, freedom from ethical rules, and the full support of the regime to pursue his interests. His experiments did not produce meaningful science, but they revealed how ideology and cruelty could corrupt medicine entirely. Under his supervision, the idea of healing had been turned upside down, replaced by suffering carried out in the name of research. For the prisoners who endured his attention, there was no escape. Each selection, each examination, and each experiment was another reminder of how completely their lives were controlled by someone who viewed them as tools rather than human beings. And for the world watching decades later, Mengele's time at Auschwitz stands as one of the clearest examples of how science, when detached from morality, can become a weapon of unimaginable destruction. As the Soviet army advanced toward Auschwitz in January 1945, Josef Mengele's time at the camp came to an end. He gathered what documents and research notes he could, destroyed evidence, and liquidated many of his remaining test subjects before fleeing. On January 18th, just days before the camp was liberated, Mengele escaped westward along with other SS doctors. He disguised himself as a soldier, blending into retreating units as Nazi Germany collapsed around him. In June 1945, he was captured by American forces. At that time, however, his crimes were not widely known outside survivor accounts, and the Allies lacked a complete list of Nazi doctors. Mengele was using a false name and carried no SS identification tattoo, which many SS members had. As a result, the Americans held him briefly but did not realize who he was. He was released and vanished into the disarray of post-war Europe. For the next several years, he lived under assumed identities. With help from his wealthy family in Bavaria and networks of former Nazis, he was able to evade detection. His wife Irene eventually divorced him, but his relatives continued to provide him with money and support. In 1949, using the name Helmut Greger, he obtained false papers and fled to South America. Like many other Nazis, he found refuge in Argentina, a country that under President Juan Perón welcomed exiles from Germany, including those with ties to the Nazi regime. In Argentina, Mengele lived comfortably. He worked as a businessman, moved in circles of Nazi sympathizers, and felt little risk of being caught. For several years, he even used his real name, secure in the knowledge that local authorities would not pursue him. By the mid-1950s, he was financially stable and remarried, this time to Martha, the widow of his own brother. He seemed to have escaped justice and was rebuilding his life far away from the ruins of Europe. But survivors had not forgotten him. As details of Auschwitz and his experiments became public, Nazi hunters and war crimes investigators placed Mengele high on their list of fugitives. In 1959, West Germany issued an arrest warrant and formally requested his extradition. By this point, Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had been captured in Argentina by Israeli agents. Fearing he would be next, Mengele fled again, this time to Paraguay, and eventually to Brazil. In Brazil, he lived under a series of false names, including Wolfgang Gerhard. He moved frequently between rural farms and small communities, supported at times by other Nazi sympathizers and by his family back in Germany. His life became one of constant caution. He was never able to return openly to Europe, though he secretly visited family once in the 1950s. Despite the growing network of investigators seeking him, including Israel's Mossad and German authorities, he always seemed to slip away before they arrived. For decades, survivors of Auschwitz and families of victims demanded justice. Nazi hunters, such as Simon Wiesenthal, and organizations dedicated to tracking war criminals continued to pursue leads. At times it seemed that Mengele was within reach. Rumors placed him in Paraguay, in Uruguay, or hiding elsewhere in South America. But concrete evidence remained elusive, and his protectors helped him remain out of sight. Even as international pressure grew and rewards were offered for his capture, he was never arrested. By the 1970s, Mengele was living quietly in Brazil. He remained in contact with his son, Rolf, whom he met for the last time in 1977. During that meeting, Rolf later recalled, his father expressed no remorse for his actions. Instead, Mengele insisted he had done nothing wrong, claiming that his experiments had been intended to help children and that reports of his brutality were fabrications. For his son, it was a disturbing encounter with a man who seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge the reality of his crimes. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele died after suffering a stroke while swimming off the coast of São Paulo. He was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard in a small cemetery. His death went unnoticed by the wider world, and for years authorities continued to search for him, unaware he was already gone. It was not until 1985 that investigators, following a trail of evidence, exhumed the grave and confirmed through forensic testing that the body was indeed Mengele. The revelation was a bitter conclusion. Josef Mengele, remembered by survivors as the Angel of Death, had escaped trial and accountability. He never faced a court, never heard a sentence passed against him, and never expressed regret for the thousands of lives he had destroyed. The knowledge that he had lived freely for decades, while his victims suffered, left a deep sense of injustice. Historians estimate that he personally conducted hundreds of selections, sending tens of thousands of prisoners to their deaths in the gas chambers. At least 1,500 pairs of twins were subjected to his experiments, with only a small fraction surviving. Many more individuals with unique physical traits or medical conditions were exploited and killed in his pursuit of racial science. The full number of victims remains impossible to calculate, but the scale of suffering is beyond doubt. The story of Josef Mengele remains one of the darkest reminders of how science and medicine can be twisted when stripped of ethics and compassion. His work at Auschwitz did not advance human knowledge. Instead, it exposed the dangers of ideology overriding humanity. For the survivors, the memories of his cold demeanor and the cruelty of his experiments were scars that lasted a lifetime. And for the world, his story continues to serve as a warning of what happens when doctors abandon the principle that once guided their profession. First, do no harm.